Production of The Making of Milwaukee is made possible with grants from Greater Milwaukee Foundation, Halbert and Alice Kadish Fund, Paddock Fund, Lidkey Smith Fund, Otto Borchard Family Fund, Catherine and Walter Lindsay Fund, Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, Keppen Gerlach Foundation, Faye Macbeth Foundation, Northwestern Mutual Foundation, David and Julia Eline Charitable Foundation, We Energies, Joseph and Vera Zilber Foundation, Polybill Foundation, Douglas and Eleanor Seaman Trust, C.G. Schmidt, and by the MPTV Friends.
Milwaukee moved to a different music in the late 1800s. The city still tanned hides and butchered hogs, but its tune changed from processing to manufacturing. Products of the earth gave way to products of steel, especially machinery. Metal bending became a way of life, and by 1900, Milwaukee was the self-proclaimed machine shop of the world. The Falk Corporation tells the story in a nutshell, or at least a gearbox. Falk is the largest manufacturer of precision industrial gears in America, but its roots go back to a 19th century brewery.
Franz Falk, the German immigrant we met earlier, was one of Milwaukee's pioneer brewers. His Menominee Valley plant was among the city's largest, and it flourished until 1892, when a pair of disastrous fires convinced his family to sell out to the Pabst Company. Falk's older sons took jobs with Pabst. Hermann, one of the youngest, chose a different direction. He opened a small machine shop in a corner of the old brewery and began to tinker. Hermann's first success was a foundry on wheels, a device used to weld streetcar tracks together in place. From there, he got into gears, becoming a major manufacturer of gears used in mines, steel mills, ships, and a host of other applications. It was Falk gears that opened and closed the lock gates on the Panama Canal. As the business grew, Hermann Falk built, on land his father had purchased in the 1850s, one of the largest factories in the Menominee Valley. That plant, much enlarged, is still in business today, and it symbolizes the larger shift in Milwaukee's economy. The Falk family moved from beer to gears, from malt to machinery in a single generation. Milwaukee attracted a host of other tinkerers who began with small shops and large dreams. Henry Harnischfeger was one of them. Born in Germany, he was a master mechanic who got tired of working for others. In 1884, Harnischfeger and his partner, Alonzo Pauling, opened a small machine shop in the Walker's Point neighborhood. It was so flimsy that snow blew in through the cracks in the siding, and tools froze to the partners' hands each winter morning. But Pauling and Harnischfeger did excellent work. They attracted customers like Bruno Nordberg and Christopher Lavallee. Both men graduated to shops of their own in the Walker's Point neighborhood. Nordberg eventually became a world leader in mine hoists and diesel engines. Lavallee made a full line of construction machinery driven by endless chains of metal links. He called his firm the Chain Belt Company. Pauling and Harnischfeger soon developed product lines of their own. Traveling overhead cranes became their specialty, and no one in the world made more. Walker's Point prospered as Milwaukee's industrial incubator. Dozens of small shops planted there sprouted into gigantic enterprises, and not all were started by immigrants. Henry Harnischfeger's neighbors included A.O. Smith, whose family ran a bicycle factory. In 1899, Smith built America's first pressed steel automobile frame in that shop. He would ultimately become the nation's largest maker of car frames. A few blocks away, Edward Kearney and Theodore Trecker started a small shop whose specialty was machine tools. Kearney and Trecker would become one of the most trusted names in industry. Just down the block from Harnischfeger, brothers Lynd and Harry Bradley experimented with new ways to control electric motors. Dr. Stanton Allen, a family friend, invested $1,000 in the Bradleys' dream. After a long series of technical failures and financial setbacks, the device was perfected, and Allen Bradley became the last word in industrial motor control. The largest industry in Walker's Point was also the oldest, Edward P. Alice's Reliance Works. In the late 1800s, his plant made the largest steam engines in the world. When the original Alice complex was filled to capacity, the firm bought land to expand just west of Milwaukee. The site was called, naturally, West Alice. The company gave birth to a new suburb, and it acquired a new name in a 1901 merger, Alice-Chalmers. Growing with West Alice, Alice-Chalmers became one of the leading manufacturers of heavy machinery on Earth. On the other side of town, an American legend was born. In about 1901, two benchmates at a Milwaukee bicycle factory began to discuss ideas for a motorized cycle. Their names were William Harley and Arthur Davidson. Two more Davidsons joined the effort, and in 1903, their father, a cabinet maker by trade, built them a 10 by 15-foot wooden shed behind the family home on the west side. The quartet eventually moved downhill to the plant that is still Harley-Davidson's headquarters. By 1917, they were turning out 18,000 motorcycles a year. Milwaukee has been a mecca for motorcycle lovers ever since. Regular reunions draw tens of thousands of fans, all coming to pay homage to the bike that made Milwaukee famous. Motors, machinery, and metal bending signified a new economic order for the city. Even as manufacturing took over, however, Milwaukee's best-known industry continued to grow. In 1890, in fact, for the first and only time in the city's history, beer was Milwaukee's most important product. Pabst remained the dominant brewer, and a Pabst ad described beer as the ideal tonic for harried moderns.
As old companies prospered and new ones multiplied, industry developed an unshakable grip on Milwaukee. By 1910, 57% of the city's adult males were industrial workers. That was the second highest concentration in America. Only Detroit, the nation's emerging automotive center, had a higher proportion. But prosperous industries did not mean prosperous workers.
Tens of thousands endured conditions we'd consider criminal today. Leather tanners had some of the foulest smelling jobs in America. Iron workers had some of the hottest. Bayview's mill hands faced temperatures of 160 degrees or more. Packing plant workers spent their days up to their elbows in hog entrails. Machine operators worked within inches of open belt drives that were a constant hazard to life and limb. Children often had full-time jobs by the age of 12. And that wasn't all. As long as immigrants flooded the labor market, employers held all the cards. Industrial workers of the 1880s put in 10 to 12-hour days, 6 days a week, with no thought of vacations and not a dime in fringe benefits. For all the perils, for all the aggravations, workers on the lowest and widest rungs of the ladder could expect to earn no more than $1.25 a day. That translates to a little over $2 an hour in modern terms, without benefits. Workers did not accept their plight without protest. Organized labor established a foothold even before Milwaukee became a city. And a variety of trade unions were formed over the decades. But Milwaukee workers lacked a single organization that was open to everyone, and a single issue that could stir them all to united action. That organization was the Knights of Labor, and that issue was the 8-hour day. The Knights were organized among Philadelphia garment workers in 1869, but they soon became an inclusive national union. The group's stated goal was to secure to the workers the full enjoyment of the wealth they create. In 1884, the National Union issued a call for an 8-hour day without a cut in pay, and Milwaukee, with Chicago, became a national center of the movement. May 1st, 1886 was set as the deadline for adoption of the 8-hour day. Some employers, including the city of Milwaukee, agreed, but most resisted, and the result was a general strike that brought the entire community to a standstill. By the morning of May 3rd, half of Milwaukee's workforce had walked off the job. Soon, only one major industry was still running, the Bayview Rolling Mill. On the morning of May 4th, a group of perhaps 1,000 workers, most of them Polish, gathered at St. Stanislaus Church to march on the mill and shut it down. Bayview's laborers, including a large number of Poles, walked out gladly. But skilled workers remained on the job. A delegation went inside to confer with management. Governor Jeremiah Rusk, in the meantime, had arrived in Milwaukee, and Governor Rusk called out the militia. One detachment was posted at E.P. Alice's Reliance Works, a center of conflict the previous day. Another was sent to quell the disturbance in Bayview. They arrived to a shower of sticks, stones, and dead fowl. Tensions eased somewhat when the rolling mill shut down. The marchers headed home, but they made it clear that they intended to return. On the morning of May 5th, 1886, the Polish workers, now 1,500 strong, regrouped at St. Stanislaus Church to resume their march on the mill. Tensions were near the breaking point. Anxious but determined, the strikers marched 4 abreast behind a banner bearing a clock face set to 8 and the legend 8 hours. The militia was waiting for them. When Governor Rusk was informed by phone that a large crowd was approaching Bayview, he replied, "Very well, sir. Fire on them." One militia captain gave his troops a more specific command.
Pick out your man and kill him.
Onward marched the strikers. At a distance of 200 yards, the militia commander ordered them to halt. They could hardly see the major, much less hear him above their own noise.
Fire!
A reporter on the scene described the reaction.
As if by a common impulse, the crowd fell headlong to the ground, and for a minute it appeared as though nearly all had been killed or wounded by the first discharge. When the troops ceased firing, all who were uninjured turned and ran pell-mell back to the city, leaving 6 dead or dying in the dusty roadway.
The number of confirmed dead reached at least 5, including a 12-year-old schoolboy who was playing hooky, and a retired mill worker who was watching from his backyard. The Bayview incident was the bloodiest labor disturbance in the state's history. Never before had there been such a dramatic uprising against the given economic order. Never before had one group of Milwaukeeans leveled deadly fire at another. The events in Bayview indicated that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The last word belonged to the workers. On May 23rd, less than 3 weeks after the shootings, nearly 5,000 marched through the streets of Milwaukee, determined to show that they would not be bullied into submission. Robert Schilling, a Knights of Labor leader who spoke after the parade, saw the tragedy as a call to political action.
The poor victims are dead and buried. They shall be revenged, not by making blood flow, not through force. The intelligent citizen has a weapon mightier than the ball or the bayonet, the ballot.
Schilling quickly formed the People's Party of Wisconsin, and workers flocked to its banner. In the fall elections of 1886, the Populists captured most county offices, half of Milwaukee's state assembly seats, and a national office as well. A millwright named Henry Smith was the People's Party's candidate for Congress in 1886. Propelled by the votes of his fellow workers, Mr. Smith went to Washington. Labor's victory was short-lived. In the next elections, Republicans and Democrats joined forces against the Populists, turning back the third-party movement. But a warning had been sounded. A precedent had been set. The Bayview incident had stirred Milwaukee's workers to common action that would lead, in time, to a more durable victory. The events of May 5, 1886 are still remembered. Each year, a diverse group of Milwaukeeans gathers in Bayview to recall a time when people marched and people died for a right that we now take for granted, the right to an 8-hour day.
To the point where I'm going to read the names of the people who lost their lives in 1886. Let us compose ourselves. Frank Conkle, Frank Novarchik, John Marsh, Robert Erdman, Johann Zaska, Martin Jakowiak, Michael Lukowski.
The problems that led to bloodshed in 1886 didn't go away. Hours were still long and wages were still low. But Milwaukee kept growing anyway, fed by a never-ending flow of new immigrants attracted by new industries. Between 1890 and 1910, Milwaukee's population doubled. The city surged past Washington, New Orleans, and Cincinnati to become the 12th largest in America.
A building boom transformed the city center at the turn of the 20th century. Scores of new landmarks appeared, some raised by industrialists as useful monuments to their success. Meatpackers built Milwaukee's first shopping center, which now anchors the shops of Grand Avenue, as well as gracious apartments with stunning views of the lake, as well as the city's first art gallery. Leather tanners erected fine hotels, and brewers were everywhere. The Pabst family built Milwaukee's first skyscraper, rising all of 13 stories. And a theater that offered some of the finest German language productions outside of Germany. The Schlitz Palm Garden brought the ambiance of a German beer garden indoors. Other landmarks were symbols of corporate might. 2 railroad depots served as the grand entrances to Milwaukee in the age of steam. Northwestern Mutual's home office was a monumental expression of financial strength. And there were public buildings of equal stature. The city's first convention center was a Victorian marvel of domes and dormers. When fire brought it down in 1905, the auditorium rose on the same site. Milwaukee County's stately courthouse filled the north half of today's Cathedral Square. The Federal Building housed the post office as well as courtrooms. A combination library and museum helped to satisfy the public's thirst for knowledge. The crowning glory of all downtown buildings, public or private, was City Hall. It was dedicated in 1895 after endless controversy over site, design, and budget. Milwaukee's first $1 million building rested on a forest of wooden pilings in a former swamp, but it fast became a civic icon and symbol of pride. City Hall was also an ethnic statement. Its turrets and towers represented a deep bow to Milwaukee's Germanic traditions. New landmarks appeared in the residential districts. As industrial fortunes swelled, architects designed castles for a new class of kings. Grand Avenue, now West Wisconsin Avenue, was lined with mansions from 9th Street all the way to 35th. Highland Boulevard, just a few blocks north, was loaded with families who were, well, loaded. Among them Pabsts, Millers, Gettlemans, Usingers, Kiekheifers, and filters. So many wealthy Germans lived on Highland that it was dubbed Sauerkraut Boulevard. On the east side, well-heeled citizens moved up the lake bluff from Yankee Hill and lined Prospect Avenue with some of the finest Victorian mansions in the Midwest. Their next stop was North Point, where Pabst's, Fox, Smith's, and Cudahy's shared a view of the water tower. The wealthy districts were dwarfed by working-class neighborhoods that sprang up on all sides of the city. Housing for workers, whether Polish flats on the south side or duplexes on the German north side, made Milwaukee one of the most densely populated cities in America. By 1902, only Boston and Baltimore had more people per acre.
There wasn't much of a middle class in turn of the century Milwaukee. A few neighborhoods were built for the movers and shakers, while the rest belonged to the moved and shaken. Those contrasts carried far beyond the city's borders. Between 1890 and 1910, Milwaukee's outward growth produced no fewer than 8 suburbs. They mirrored the wealthy and working class extremes of the city itself, especially along the lakeshore. As always, old neighborhoods set the pattern for new ones.
Bayview provided the model for the southern lakeshore. The old iron mill town was still an industrial powerhouse. In the 1890s, Patrick Cudahy moved his packing plant from the Menominee Valley to a large tract of land south of Bayview. The plant gave rise to a suburb that still bears the founder's name. Just down the lakeshore from Cudahy, South Milwaukee developed an industrial character of its own. The suburb's largest employer for many years was the Bucyrus Steam Shovel Company, later known as Bucyrus Erie. Industry ruled the southern lakeshore, but something quite different was happening on the other side of Milwaukee Bay. In 1894, some of the Gold Coast's younger set began to play a new game on the edge of town, using tomato cans for cups and bandanas for flags. Pasture pool, the skeptics called it. But golf took root. Before long, it was the primary pastime of the Milwaukee Country Club, whose members opened an elegant clubhouse on the lake bluff. In 1900, the land around the club was incorporated as East Milwaukee, a suburb known today as Shorewood. Just north was Captain Frederick Pabst's Whitefish Bay Resort, a beer garden that drew throngs of Milwaukeeans coming out by carriage on Lake Drive or by steamer from downtown. In 1892, the land around the resort was incorporated as Whitefish Bay, another community destined for affluence. From sand traps on one side to stockyards on the other, Milwaukee Bay separated two different worlds. There was similar variety in the inland suburbs. 3 were industrial: North Milwaukee, West Milwaukee, and West Allis, whose largest taxpayer was Allis Chalmers. The 4th was Wauwatosa, an old Yankee village that had become a gracious bedroom suburb. With a bumper crop of new suburbs and a builder's catalog of new landmarks, Milwaukee was taking on all the earmarks of a thoroughly modern metropolis. Its residents were also embracing the latest technologies. The first telephones went into service in 1877, serving a total of 3 subscribers. By 1896, there were 3,000. Public transit in Milwaukee had always meant cars drawn by horses or mules. In 1890, the West Side Street Railway won a furious race to electrify. One reporter described the cars whizzing down Wells Street like streaks of lightning on roller skates. During the same years, gas light steadily gave way to electric light. The newfangled bulbs turned night to day in the city's breweries, beer gardens, and music halls. A few Milwaukeeans were exploring an even newer technology. The first automobiles, most of them electrics, were so novel that they were the vehicles of honor in a 1900 Civic parade.
Milwaukee was changing, but it still moved to a rhythm all its own, a measured pace that blended large and small, old world and new. Luckily, we have an outstanding visual record of the period. The city had grown large enough to attract some master photographers, people like H.H. Bennett, Sumner Madison, and Robert Taylor. Their images form a Milwaukee family album from the turn of the 20th century. Despite its rank as America's 12th largest city, Milwaukee did have both the feel and the self-image of a much smaller community. A century later, it's still often referred to as a big, small town. An important reason for that character was, and is, the proximity of Chicago.
Milwaukeeans were fully aware that their old rival had won the population race. The nation's second largest city lay just 90 miles south, and there was little hope that Milwaukee could ever catch up to Chicago. Some preferred their hometown's more leisurely pace. Others gave in to a sense of civic inferiority. John Johnston, a downtown banker, voiced a similar complaint way back in 1872.
There is one thing we are deficient in here. We have not the necessary blow and brag. Not only have we not that, but we daily see men standing with their hands in their pockets, whining about Milwaukee being a one-horse town. Such men are not worthy to live here. Milwaukee is not Chicago, but there are few cities like Chicago. Still, if Milwaukee be not Chicago, Milwaukee has grown at a rate surpassed by but a very limited number of cities in this whole union. Instead of grumbling and whining, let us have some city pride, and let us not listen to any citizen of Milwaukee crying down this, the handsomest and healthiest and happiest city in the West. Let us cultivate the talent of brag, and whether at home or abroad, let us boast of Milwaukee.
Many years later, the city's boosters are still trying to cultivate the talent of brag. Municipal modesty, for better or worse, seems to be as much a part of Milwaukee as bubblers and beer. The truth is that Milwaukee has always had plenty to brag about, both then and now. But there were also reasons for concern.
Production of The Making of Milwaukee is made possible with grants from Greater Milwaukee Foundation, Halbert and Alice Kadish Fund, Paddock Fund, Lidke Smith Fund, Otto Borchard Family Fund, Catherine and Walter Lindsay Fund, Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, Keppen Gerlach Foundation, Faye Macbeth Foundation, Northwestern Mutual Foundation, David and Julia Eline Charitable Foundation, We Energies, Joseph and Vera Zilber Foundation, Polybill Foundation, Douglas and Eleanor Seaman Trust, C.G. Schmidt, and by the MPTV Friends.